Good evening and welcome. It is our privilege today to present Professor Muzaffar Alam in conversation with Avik Chanda. This session is part of a collaboration between University of Chicago Center in Delhi and Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet. The association was started in 2019 at the festival, and this year we continue the association through webinars. We look forward to presenting you, our audience, with sessions on diverse subjects and new books. Today's session is the launch of Professor Muzaffar Alam's new book, The Mughals and the Sufis, Islam and Political Imagination in India, 1500 to 1750. A quick introduction, though none is needed. Professor Muzaffar Alam is the George V. Bobrinskoy Professor in South Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. His several books include The Languages of Political Islam in India. This is a permanent black and University of Chicago Press 2004 publication. Writing the Mughal World, Studies in Political Culture, co-authored with Sanjay Subramaniam, and The Crisis of Empire in Mughal North India, 1707 to 1748, an Oxford University Press publication. He will be in conversation today with Avik Chanda. Avik Chanda is a Kolkata Literary Meet regular, a best-selling author, columnist, and entrepreneur. His books include a novel, Anchor, a business book, From Command to Empathy, and a historical biography, Dara Shuko, The Man Who Would Be King. Now, without wasting any more time, I hand this over to Avik. Avik, all yours.
Right. Thanks very much, Sukanya. And very, very big hello and warm welcome to all the viewers who are watching this particular program. And a very warm welcome to you, Muzaffarji. Now, viewers, as Sukanya indicated, the whole purpose of today's session is to celebrate and discuss Muzaffarji's new book, which is The Mughals and the Sufis. I have actually been working off a soft copy for my interviews and reviews. So Muzaffarji, may I first request you to just hold the jacket aloft, hold the book, right? Thank you very much. So this book is available and it's published in India by Permanent Black. So this is an absolute delight and it's a collector's item. So in case you don't know about the book, this is going to give you much more information about it, and hopefully you'll be enthused enough to buy yourself a copy. Muzaffarji, this book, The Mughals and the Sufis, as we were discussing, is a trailblazer in so many different ways. And if you permit, let's perhaps begin with the fundamentals. If you're talking about domains of research, domains of study, Mughal history on the one hand, and Islam in India on the other, they have traditionally remained very distinct spheres, but deep spheres of academic research. And what you have done, and you have synthesized them, harmonized them in this work. So I'm very interested to know, what prompted you on this particular project and how did you go about it?
Thank you very much. This is a fundamental question, and let me see if my response is adequate. Islam, in fact, in this book, my focus is primarily on an important feature or aspect of Islam, that is Sufism. And yes, Islam, when you extend it and include also the princes, they certainly, of course, had in their mind, or they imagined that what they should do and what they are required to do should be in keeping with the tenets of Islam. They should not violate. And when the Sufis intervene, as I have shown that Sufis are active, in fact, in politics, as well as, in fact, any other political elite of the time, they also, in fact, think that they are doing something which is in accord with the demands of Sharia and Islam. Now, of course, there are differences amongst the theologians, ulama, and divines that, of course, the Sufis, what Sharia is, what's implication of Sharia, what are the implication, what in contrast to or in completion to, complementary to whether tariqah, that is Sufism, is in contrast to or something different. That, of course, will come in case there are questions. Now, as a matter of fact, it's not me. Let us take that, we are discussing with reference to Sufism, one important feature of one important tradition of Islam. Now, it is not me that I began to, or I plan to synthesize these two spheres of Mughal history and Indian Islam. Others, including my teacher, Professor Nizami, and also Professor Rizvi earlier, and Friedman also earlier, as early as in the 70s, they have discussed, in fact, the Mughal politics, not so much, but they have in fact referred to Mughal politics. But their primary concern, of course, was the details about the Sufis, their doctrinal discourses, and also the Sufis' histories. And Professor Nizami in particular, I would mention that he had a very important article on the Mughals and the Naqshbandi Sheikhs, Naqshbandi Sufis, where he in fact shows, in what respect the Mughals were in terms of, in relations with the Sheikh Hamas, with the Naqshbandis and but still I felt, despite the fact that we have in fact several works and important works on the Sufis, on Tasawwuf in Mughal India, and a little bit of relationship also between the Sufis and the Mughal rulers. But still I felt the complexity, variety, and nuances of relationship between the Mughals and religious divines have not really been critically examined. For instance, there is not much on Chishtis. And the more important feature is of this historiography is that while there is a discussions between the Mughal rulers and the Sufis, the discussions almost exclusively, without any exceptions, whosoever has referred to Tasawwuf or Sufism in Mughal India, the discussions are confined between the Mughals and one particular branch of the Naqshbandis, that is Indian Mujaddidis. So that in fact does not give enough of or adequate, portrayal of what happened, in fact, in terms of relationship between. What I have done, in fact, is that when I started working on Sufis and the Mughals, I thought that since the Mughals came from Central Asia, let us see how were they related to the Sufis in Central Asia, and who were the Sufis who were in close contact with the Mughals, that's Timuris, their ancestors in Central Asia. So I discussed, that aspect of the Timurid relationship with the Sufis in Mughal India, in Central Asia. And then I also discussed that whether after the establishment of the Mughal rule in India, these Sufis or the descendants of the Sufis who had been in contact with their ancestors, Timurid rulers in Central Asia, whether they also, in fact, imagined something. So I have shown that, they imagined that with the extension of the Timurid power to India, their power also extended, whatever the nature of power is, spiritual power, their power also extended to India. And in terms of, in fact, relationship, as the Timurids were devoted to them in Central Asia, they should also be, or they would also be devoted to them. So that is something which is important. And we do notice some of the descendants of the major Naqshbandi 15th century saint, Khwaja Ubaidullah Ahrar, who had been, in fact, not simply in contact with the princes in Central Asia, but were actually actually as a patron of the Timurid princes after the disintegrations of the Timurid Empire and the entire Central Asia being distributed to different, in fact, branches of the Timurid family. So they came to India, And they expected, of course, the same kind of, in fact, dedication and devotion and respect, reverence to them from the conqueror of India, that's Babur. And so this is one thing that has not been noted. Perhaps I'm the first Indian historian
Yes.
who has taken into account this aspect. Secondly, I have also noticed that who were the Sufis when the Mughals uh, came to India, when they conquered India at the time of the Mughal conquest. Who were the Sufis and in what way they were related to the rulers? So I have in fact discussed independently. Of course you have discussions, but I have then tried to connect. That is, I've seen that there are such Chishtis, and then the question arises that if the Mughals were primarily Naqshbandis in terms of their spiritual connection, then how did they come close to the Chishtis? That I have discussed, and this, in fact, we have seen in the context of Akbar's politics and Akbar's ambitions to establish a kind of quote unquote absolute monarchical power, where in fact he could be in fact seen as the ruler of a country which is multi-ethnic, multicultural. So in what way then these Naqshbandis saw the social and religious situations in India, and did they have something which in fact helped the Mughals to accommodate with the existing social and religious condition in India? So these are the things that I have in fact added, and here I am. Perhaps I would not say I have pioneered, but certainly, of course, I have added significantly to whatever we had on Mughals and Sufis and Mughals and this particular aspect of Islam in earlier writings.
I think Muzaffar, the particular prism, the viewpoint that you bring to this, that is quite unique. And probably this is a good time for us to turn the lens, just shift the lens to a methodological question. In terms of the research, I mean, it's a known fact amongst academics that you're looking at the empirical research based on original sources, based on manuscripts. And the sum total, the universe of these manuscripts, not just governs and not just influences the work, but it also provides a kind of a boundary, if you will, saying this is the demarcation. Now, what you have done and what I found completely wonderful is that you've used not only the chronicles, not only the accounts which are known to everyone in the fraternity, but you have gone beyond that. So you've not only talked about the Aine Akbari and Akbar Nama and Tuzuki Jahangiri and Muntakhab Tarikh, but you've gone far beyond that into individual hagiographical accounts, individual treatises, uh, untranslated, previously unpublished, extremely rare to find manuscripts, and you have brought them into the fore. So the way that I see it, it has served many purposes, but the two main ones are the because the ambit of your research is so vast, it has added richer and deeper nuances into the analysis that you've done throughout the book. And I think equally important, you have shown to generations of scholars who follow you that look, this is the way, the whole boundary of sources, of bibliographical repertoire, this is the way the boundary itself can be extended. So the universe is not limited. You're giving hope to future scholars that there is a lot more in terms of possibility, and that I found absolutely fascinating. So if you could tell us more about this.
So, yeah, thank you very much. This is also very important and good question, difficult question also. Uh, Before I come to this question, I should have added earlier that when I said that, it's not Islam as such, it's just one aspect of Islam. And I should have added there also that there are limitations in my work, even not in this work, even earlier. I have not discussed. When I use Islam, I have in mind two two important features of Islamic traditions. One is jurisprudence, which of course regulated the society, Islamic society, Muslim society throughout history. And second, of course, is tasawwuf and Sufism. And while my book, in fact, in an important way, fulfills, in fact, and gives attention to the aspect of Islam that is Sufism and politics, I have not discussed much jurisprudence. As a matter of fact, there is not, in fact, a good work on jurisprudence and in Mughal India. For instance, we have, in fact, a major compilation of the Fatawa, which is actually a fiqh book. It's not Fatawa, because Fatawa is, in fact, corrections of the verdicts which the muftis or the ulama give in response to day-to-day questions. And this Fatawa Alamgiri is, in fact, reads like an independent and book on jurisprudence. So there is nothing much. But recently, in French, a scholar whose name is Moïse Khalafoui, he had a PhD in Erfurt University, and that he has also translated now his French thesis. It was submitted in French into English, and that's, in fact, the only one book that we have today. Earlier, in fact, one of my friends in Aligarh, Professor Muzaffar Alam, who is now retired, and he was in Central Asian and Islamic Studies, he has, in fact, published several articles in Urdu and also in English on jurisprudence in medieval history. So that is, I think, unless we have, in fact, a combination of the examinations of the sources relating to jurisprudence, tasawwuf, and the political chronicles, quote unquote, secular administrative documents, only then we will have an adequate picture of what the Mughal state was like. So this is what I thought that I should have added earlier to whatever response that I gave you. Now, yes, when I decided to work on this book, I noticed, and this is in fact a bane of the tradition of historiography, has been that the scholars working on Mughal India were generally divided into two groups. The ones who dealt with political and economic history and focused on political chronicles, and the others who dealt political chronicles and administrative documents, agrarian documents, and others who dealt with religious history traditions, so they read Tazkiras of the Sufis, some of the text, Sufi treatises on doctrinal discourses. I realized that for a good discussions of what was going on in Mughal India, this dichotomy and compartmentalizations needs to be broken. Of course, I mean, those who would read the Tazkiras and Sufi treatises, they would get job in the Department of Religion in our country too, and much more in this country, in USA. And those who would read only the political chronicles and administrative documents, they will be in the history department. So you would rarely find, in fact, in the history department, the scholars, in earlier time, who would be primarily interested in religious texts and religious traditions. I realized that for a good discussions of what was going on in Mughal India, this compartmentalization needs to be broken. I repeat. Therefore, I read both the political chronicles, which I had been trained to read even earlier, and available administrative records, as well as the Tazkiras and the Sufi treatises on doctrinal discourses. Each of these, I realize, supports, qualifies, also sometimes, in fact, rejects the things that you have from the other set of the resources. But they all enrich each other. Each set enriches the other. And together they form a very valuable and rich combinations of resources to shed light on Mughal Indian life and Mughal Indian culture. This is the methodology that I tried to pursue. Ideally, theological texts should also have been incorporated with these two textual domains for a better and more comprehensive picture. Several Sufis were also theologians. There is no, in fact, distinct lines which will enable you to differentiate between an alim, a theologian, and a Sufi. Sometimes, theology and Sufism combine in one person. Sufis, theologians, and rulers but they all occupied, theologians, Sufis, or the rulers, they all occupied their own worlds, different worlds. But they also shared a world between them. It is in fact this world that my ambition was to retrieve, to understand. To understand this world, all three, of course, must have been examined together, but I examine only two sets of the sources. And therefore, I conclude, and I will in fact quote it from the last 4 or 5 lines of my conclusion in the book, that it is an attempt to address this gap in the literature in the hope that future historians will pay more attention to many texts which our predecessors have too often set aside as hagiographical or mythological. They would say that these hardly have any you know any importance, any relevance for the historical or material life of the
Right.
average people. And they would refuse to examine them together with the quote unquote secular political chronicles, secular memoirs like Tuzuke Jahangiri or Tuzuke Babri, travel accounts, and epistolary collections. We are still very far away from the time when the last word will have been said about the relationship between the Mughals and the Sufis, even Sufis of their time, let alone Islam as such. So this is what my response would be to your very significant questions, and it is a difficult questions. I don't know how much my response was satisfactory.
Uh, Very insightful as always, Muzaffarji. It's such a treat, not just listening to you, but every time we have a conversation, I get to learn afresh and anew. So, just for my own selfish vested interest, I love to be part of conversations with you. I look for these opportunities. Muzaffarji, one of the very important things that your book accomplishes is that it analyzes and it deconstructs, and to wherever necessary, it debunks the myths and sort of preconceived notions that people have about the Sufis, about their relationship with the monarchs of the day. So, if you could summarize for us briefly your key findings in this regard.
Yeah, in fact, we may begin here with a brief descriptions of the doctrinal basis of the Sufi orders I have discussed, and also their histories, because my discussion is with reference to the Mughal, primarily Mughal princes and Mughal rulers, and the Sufis on the other hand, and the Sufis very largely the Chishtis and the Naqshbandis, and also not so largely but very significantly with reference to Dara Shikoh and
Qadiris as well.
Jahanara Padri.
Ji.
So therefore, I mean, I think that I should go first uh, to a brief descriptions of these Sufis and their doctrinal basis. The Chishtis were already in India, we know, and despite their dissociation with the court, I won't go into the discussions, the question of shagal, whether you should participate in politics or you should not. I mean, this is how it has been interpreted. But actually, I read it whether you should be associated with the court, in the same way as any other member of the society or not. So they endorsed a politics, these Chishtis, earlier before the coming of the Mughals, of accommodations and reconciliations with the local non-Islamic traditions. On the other hand, the Naqshbandis who came to India with the Mughals did not approve of compromise and accommodations with social and religious practices of the others. There is a significant expression, phrase in the Naqshbandi, Central Asian Naqshbandi text, Rusume Biganagan. Rusum, plural of rasm, custom, customary, and Biganagan is strangers. That is the other. So, they are not in support of borrowing or accommodating, borrowing from, let alone borrowing from, accommodating with the Rusume Bigangan. Unless you shun, you reject everything from the social and customary practices of the other, you are not a good Muslim. So, and therefore, so this is one. And their understanding of power is also different, including the Sufic or spiritual power. I have discussed this in details and I would not go, in fact, in the details here. And, the Chishtis also believe in spiritual power, but their spiritual power, the nature of their understanding of their spiritual power is diametrically, in fact, opposed to or different from the one that you have amongst the Naqshbandis, especially in Central Asia. And that tradition, in fact, continued even in India, in the Mujaddidi family of Sarian. Then there was also serious differences between them in their understanding of reality with capital R, in their understanding of Tawheed, because they all believe, whether the Naqshbandis or the Chishtis, that the reality is one, that great being. Now, that great being with capital B, how that great being presents himself with capital H in everything in this world that we, in fact, observe and we see. So that is, and this is, in other words, in fact, they all are monotheistic. They all are Mawahid. But their understanding of Tawheed is different. And in Sufi circles, this difference is expressed in the technical terms of Wahdat al-Wujud and Wahdat al-Shahud. Wahdat al-Wujud means unity of being, the real unity, and the Wahdatul Shuhud means the unity in perception, in your observation. It is not really one. It is in your perceptions that you are different from the other. You are different from God. You are just a manifestation, but manifestation does not mean that you are really one with the God. You may be, of course, that union, communion, that vessel, of course, could be in poetry, could be also after your death. But in this world, you are different. But so the Chishtis are Wahdatul Wujudi. They believe that no, you are one with the God. I mean, even in this world.
Yes.
And all the other, in fact, manifestations of Allah, of God, are in fact one with each other. Now, you can imagine the social implication. If all the others are, in fact, one with each other, then the differences are only in name. The differences are not in realities. Now, so it is, in fact, now you are in a country which is multi-religious, multicultural, multi-social. Now, in this country where you have manifestations of that great reality, in fact, in different forms, how would you manage? Now, for the Naqshbandis, it will be difficult. And then if you are close to Naqshbandis, and you have to be, because they are also socially very powerful in the society, in Muslim
and also economically, right? And also economically, yes, in terms of resources and funds.
Yes. So there will be difficulties. Then how would you encounter and how would you manage these difficulties? This is what, in fact, the Mughal politics from Akbar's time until about Shah Jahan's time. And then, of course, in Aurangzeb's time, there is a compromise. But I will come to this question later if there are questions or if you have any questions. So, but the difference between the two approaches is very much evident in their assessment of, for instance, and I am very fond of citing this example in their assessment of Akbar. Now, Akbar is great, of course, great in the sense that he built the empire. But Akbar as a Muslim, in Naqshbandi memory, in India, in Naqshbandi Mujaddidi memory, Akbar is the destroyer of Islam. But on the other hand, and I was also totally surprised. In fact, this was one of the things which, in fact, induced me to read a little more about the Chishtis and the Naqshbandis and see how they are relevant in Mughal politics. In the Chishti text, in some of the major Chishti texts, whenever Akbar's name is mentioned, they add the formulaic Rahmatullah, that is, God bless him. And you add this formulaic expressions, Arabic formulaic expressions, generally only with reference to the Sufis and the pious ulama. So, this difference in their assessment of Akbar. So Akbar is the builder of Islam. In other words, Akbar is the real builder of Islam, not simply builder of Mughal state, but Islamic state. On the other hand, from the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi point of view, Akbar was destroyed of Islam, and the state that he built was not Islamic. So that is something that. So therefore, and then you come to the Qadris. That's in fact, the third Sufi order, which of course came to India and became widespread during the 16th and 17th century. Qadris too, in terms of their doctrinal positions, were close to the Chishtis, that they are Wahdatul Wujudis. We thus have Prince Dara Shikoh. He is inspired to initiate a significant discussions of similarity between Islam and Brahminical traditions. And a major Qadri Sufi, Mullah Shah Badakhshi, was his Piro Murshid, his spiritual preceptor. While on the other hand, we see the Sirhindi Naqshbandi Sheikhs flourishing in Aurangzeb's time.
Yes.
In Aurangzeb's time. So my key findings thus resolve around the importance of the Chishti, Naqshbandi, Qadri orders in Mughal India and their significant interactions with Mughal politics. Doctrinally, broadly, they form two forces. Their interplay and tensions constitute the prime contours along which I take my study.
Absolutely, Muzaffarji, and what your book does with aplomb is that it charts two trajectories. So one is the trajectory from Babur to Humayun to Akbar, and you've gone all the way to Dara Shikoh and Aurangzeb and beyond. So there is the trajectory of the Mughal rulers themselves and their relationship with the populace that they're overseeing, right? That they're ruling, the predominant population being non-Muslim, and how they go about doing that, subjugating, and how they go about, if I may use the word, co-opting in their own way. And in parallel, you have another trajectory where you have these two schools. So if you take maybe Chishti and together with that Qadri and Qadri Sabri on one hand, who are far more pluralistic and syncretic and accommodating and advocate the principle of reconciliation. And then you have on the other hand Naqshbandis. And what you show is that for every single individual, not just ruler, but also when it comes to people of the royal household. So Dara Shikoh and Jahanara, with their highly philosophical, mystical viewpoints and experiences, and their allegiance to the Chishti and the Qadri schools, and their own siblings, Roshan Ara Begum and Aurangzeb, who are very staunch advocates of the Naqshbandi, the very, very strident, conservative, orthodox Naqshbandi. So it's two multiple streams that run completely through the book. And you see the interplay, not just between the orders themselves, but the interplay across various stakeholders in the royal household and the Sufi order. So, it's so layered, it's so nuanced that it definitely requires rereading, because at every rereading, you have additional flavors and additional insights that come through. At least, that was my experience. I'm sure viewers who read the book will have a very similar experience. Muzaffarji, I want to shift the discussion. You talked about earlier in the session, right? You talked about the hagiographical accounts. You talked about mystical experiences and why, and the reason why uh, uh, particular scholars, they said that this is not of relevance, this is not of pertinence, this is certainly not, for a historical scholar, right? What you have done, again, astonishingly, is that on the one hand you have gone in your usual inimicable style, is very, very, very deep into the sources, into the dates, into every single nuance of the trajectory of, or the evolution of the Sufi orders in India from empirically verifiable sources. And you have, again, I use the word astonishingly, amalgamated or harmonized that with individual hagiographical accounts where Sufis have out of body, or completely divine epiphanies. They have these makashfas, right? And I was wondering how, uh, an academic and intellectual of your very, very strict grounding on empirical evidence, right, um, went about sort of, if I may use the word, reconciling or adapting the hagiographical accounts and makashfas into the empirical records.
So this is slightly convoluted and delicate question, because Mokashfa and the Sufi in the society. Yes, Mokashfa is very important. Epiphanies, the Sufis claims, or quote unquote tall claim, that they have been somewhere else and they are coming back from Makkah. They are living, of course, they are in Allahabad, for instance, or in Delhi, and they would claim that they have gone to Makkah or Medina for evening prayer and they'll come back within half an hour. So these are, of course, the Sufic world. And these are the worlds which, in fact, are inexplicable even to me. I am an ordinary human being. And my primary concern is not this aspect of Sufism. My primary concern is that Sufism also works as an important social force. The Sufis are also active agents in changing, in, in transforming several aspects of our everyday life. And we go to the Sufis for many of the things which concern this material world, this world. Of course, we would also believe that when we approach the Sufi, we get, in fact, something through his blessings, which would be a kind of reward for me in the life hereafter. But for many things in this world, the politics of the Mughals of this world, the politics of Darashuko for this world, even if he would claim that he is in conversation with Vashishta Muni, or he is the younger brother of Raja Ramchandra. So my primary concern is, of course, my primary concern is Mokashfa and Epiphany, because it is these epiphanies and the Mokashfas which attract the people like you and me, the ordinary, members of the court and the rulers who hardly had any spiritual position in Sufic terms and in Islamic terms. It is because of these epiphanies that these Sufis attract these
Their
secular,
followers.
quote unquote, people to them. But my primary concern is, in fact, Sufism or Sufis as a social force. I show that Sufi is a social force in society, closely connected with everyday life, everyday material life, including the court. I was not concerned, in fact, primarily with epiphanies as such, even though they do feature in Sufi tazkiras prominently. And it is due to these epiphanies, as I have earlier, in fact, submitted, the different sections of the people, including the political elites, get attracted to them. What I'm interested in is how these epiphanies generate a condition in which the king or the noble come to them. So many people, in fact, claim to perform miracles, karamat,
Yes.
but only some of them are in a position to attract. Now, when I go to these Sufis, I find that they also have some other sources of strength besides this inexplicable spiritual phenomena. So I, in fact, have taken into account those factors as well, which in fact could be easily intelligible, underst- could be understood by people like us, by my readers. Here, in my understanding, Sufis as emerge as social force for this material world, and I emphasize this material world. The truth of the Makashfa by itself becomes less important for me. But of course, I cannot deny the importance because it is through the Mukashfas and through these epiphanies that their stature is in fact evaluated, determined by their contemporaries, the other people, by the other, that is other than the Sufis. More important for my purpose is what kind of political and social force is represented by the Sufi, whether achieved by Mukashfa or by any other means. I'm not concerned with that. A Sufi, in fact, could be just a pakka jhuta. He could be a liar. But if he is in a position to win the support, to come to,
Influence, to convince, to persuade people.
and if he is believed to be a Sufi by the people who matter around the court and in the politics, then I will, in fact, take him seriously. So it is not the question of my faith in that Sufi, or so. Therefore, Mokashfa is important, epiphanies are important, but more important are the result of the Mokashfas which are associated with them, and the result, that is the attractions of, or the realizations of the need, the necessity on the part of those political elites or military commanders to come to them. So this is how I respond. Yes,
In
please.
fact, exactly. So my understanding, Muzaffarji, is you're less concerned about verifying the authenticity of Mukashfa, but what you have analyzed is the way that these Mukashfas themselves serve as tools for propaganda, and if I may use a modern word, for marketing.
Yes,
Their
yes.
respective silsilas, their respective ideas, the superiority of their own silsila over the others, to the common masses. Not just to the common masses, but also to the nobility, also to members of the royal household. For example, and this is articulated beautifully throughout your book, be that Babar, who has himself these epiphanies of Khaja Arar at the Battle of Panipat, who Khaja Arar was long dead and gone by then, to the epiphanies that Dara Shukro had, in his dreamlike state. That thing continues. So, Muzaffarji, I wanted to bring up, and I know we are talking about all the difficult, all the controversial things around historiography. So while we're at it, maybe another one, right? No less controversial amongst scholars and academics. And that is when we talked about methodology, we talked about research, we talked about the adaptation and reconciliation of different kinds of sources. Now let's talk also about the output, the actual output of historical research in terms of the way that narratives are written. And here, in this context, if you take imagination or historical imagination, this has been a bone of contention, right? Because there, in a purely Rankian kind of mode, you have to write things as they were, without taking any liberties or without trying to put yourself there or beyond, sort of going beyond that into realms of imagination. What is your own sort of position on this, and how do you view this entire construct?
Yeah, I mean, I think historical imaginations, and you would have noticed in fact, I use, of course, this is because of my friend discussions. It came out as a result of my discussions with my friend Rukun. I mean, Rukun is not simply publisher. He is a friend and he is a scholar by himself in his own right. This imagination, political imagination. So without imaginations, or whether it is political imaginations or historical, of course, in this context, historical imagination, I could not have thought of my book. I used historical imagination. I may not be, of course, very perfect in terms of historiographical debates around this question. But what I have in mind when I think of historical imagination is, in fact, are these three important features. First is the identification and location of evidence. And the second is evaluation and examinations, or the veracity, the question of the examination of the veracity of this evidence, of the evidence that I have located. And evidence, of course, as I told you, Mukashfa could also be evidence, which could be difficult to be established, in fact, physically. And then, of course, is the context. For me, the context and the environment in which, in fact, I have located and identified my evidence. That is absolutely necessary, both to construct this context out of the sources and to place the source in considerations in this context. Both require historical imagination. That is historical imagination. When I use the word historical imagination, I use, in fact, in this sense. The historian, in my understanding, must not continue to think of the historical worlds he is interested in like the world of his own time. I'm discussing the Sufis and Jahangir. I should not use, in fact, the word rationality, whether it is rational or whether it is irrational. That will be absolutely irrelevant question historically, in my understanding, because then I'm actually imposing the criteria of understanding of our
present
own
day sensibilities.
And I should not use the term that ye to uska vaham tha. He just thought about it. Like you have, in fact, I have mentioned one dream of Jahangir in which he saw something where he also he imagined that Akbar and his ancestors were there and he wanted to go there, but the person who was there in that control of that tower where from something was hanging, and the people were either this side of the river or that side of the river. I would not go into the details. I have mentioned this in my book. So he was asked then, no, he was told that you cannot join them. And then, of course, when he woke up, he looked for Sufis to interpret
the dream. Yes.
And he was told that this is actually that was the Malakul Maut, the angel of death, and he was actually handling, in fact, the world, and he when somebody dies, he goes to one side and the other side, and you were told that this was a kind of, in fact, forecast for you that you would live much longer. So that is, when I and you read today, and when I use my criteria, my own times criteria, I would say, what is this? This is, in fact, just tawahum. It's just, superstitions. And this is not a rational approach. So I think, therefore, my focus would be that historian must not continue to think of the historical worlds that he is interested to be like the world of his own time, because this would then result in, I'm using this word deliberately, massive mistakes. Writing in the 21st century, about 17th century, requires the historians to be able to imagine the historical world to which his source belongs and to make sense of it in that world. This is impossible without, I use the term historical imagination. Placing sources, text, evidence in context is absolutely necessary. You have to think according to the period under study, not according to your own contemporary world. But while I emphasize this, I must also warn of the dangers of excess of imagination. History is history. History is not fiction. Otherwise, you might fictionalize. And you may have seen, in fact, several, and I have read several Urdu books at least, where in fact the stories of the Sufis read like the fictionalized stories,
Yes.
even in terms of the criteria of the time that the Sufis lived, because you have also some other, sources, and then, so this is what I would, this is how I would respond to your question. Yeah, please.
Muzaffarji, thank you so much for that. I see we've started to have some questions from the live audience, from the viewers. But before we go there, there's a final question that I wanted to ask you. I mean, we've had this discussion, and I've had the privilege of discussing this particular question that I'm going to bring up in private. But now I definitely want the viewers also to have an insight or into that, and that talks really about, we talked about the orders or the silsilas, right? They're like these gharanas. And if you look at the last, at least the last 100 years, going all the way back to Sir Jodhanath Chowkar and his rank in school and his immediate followers, and then you look at the rival silsila, if you will, of the Aligarh Muslim University and the Marxist thought. You have subaltern school. Nowadays, in the new 21st century, you have new schools and new ways, new means of looking at the past. And it seems to be that many a times these different silsilas, that there's kind of almost a rift, an intellectual rift, or a schism between them. They don't talk to each other. They don't necessarily engage with each other. They criticize each other intellectually, or with respect to facts and counterfacts and arguments, but they don't necessarily engage, let alone synthesize or harmonize. And what your work throughout your scholarship and research has shown, is that you take elements, you take the insights, you take the findings across all of these schools, and then you harmonize them together. So it's to borrow a leaf from Dara Shiko's own book, if the Jodhanath Chowkar is one ocean and the AMU is another ocean, you have broken the boundaries of these, and mixed these oceans together. It's become in terms of an academic course, like a Majma ul Bahrain of these otherwise antagonistic oceans in a way. So I wanted you to reflect and give your views on this.
Yeah, in fact, these questions, in fact, have been asked by several friends of mine, including you, of course. You more seriously, and even non-seriously by some of our students. And I would also respond sometimes in a non-serious way, but with serious implication, that I visit each Sufi center. You use the term silsila, and we are discussing Sufis. Silsila,
Yes.
of course, is a particular technical terms for the Sufi genealogical line. I visit each Sufi center, and whosoever gives me hookah, bubble, and wherever I'm welcome, I then, of course, sit in that center, and I observe, of course, with my own way of observing the things critically or non-critically, but never negatively. And then, of course, I pick up whatever is good there. In fact, there is a hadith, prophetic hadith, which Abdurrahman Chishti, who is my favorite Sufi of the 17th century, Chishti Sufi, he cites when he summarizes Gita in Persian. Of course, he transformed Gita into a kind of Sufi text, Miratul Haqaiq, the mirror of the realities. He called it mirror of realities. And he discusses in the preface, he uses the word, Khuz ma safa da'a ma kadir. Whatever is good, take it. That is yours. And whatever is bad, that's not yours. Reject it. So that is what my position has been. Now, with this preface, I say, yes, in my earlier career, I was a Marxist, quote unquote, Marxist historian. The Marxist or Marxian, my approach was Marxian. But even in those days, many of my friends would say that, and that was, of course, certainly because of the influence of my great teacher, Professor Irfan Habib and Nurul Hassan, they were Marxist. But Nurul Hassan was a different kind of Marxist. to use the simpler term, Noor Hassan was CPI-ish, and who could also reconcile with the Congress. And Irfan Habib was CPM-ish, who would unfortunately later on reconcile with the BJP, but not with the Congress. When I say BJP, in fact, in the 80s, when, of
Yes.
course, Raja Vishwanath Pratap Singh was the prime minister. So one day, our late Jitu Babu would come, and the other day it will be, Advani. So in my, this is something which in fact distract me from my main point. Therefore, I have written it. Otherwise, I would have started giving you anecdotes. So I was, even in those days, some of my friends, I remember, in fact, it was Arsalatram, late Arsalatram. He wrote the review of my book, Crisis of Empire. He said, here is a Marxist, revisionist Marxist, a very good expression. This book is a very good, in fact, presentation of revisionist Marxists. And I would agree, because, I had discussed the agrarian problems, and I call them, in fact, primarily rural disturbances. And I would, in fact, interpret them, while Irfan Habib, of course, my teacher, would interpret them as a class war. I would say it is within the same class. In fact, it is integrative in nature. And it is, in fact, to earn more and more, to get more and more from one section of power than the others. So, and the leadership is in the hands of the zamindars. So that is what the difference would be. And this also I got from my observation in the coal mines, because in the coal mines I have seen, in fact, those days, in fact, the 60s and late 60s emerging, this, Marxist power in the coal mines, Raniganj area, Asansol area was emerging. So I've seen that, how, in fact, it would be the babus, those who were, or the pachma
overseers, the managers, the foremen,
whom we would call the pachmas. They would come from the, North Bihar, beyond the Ganges, and their language bhi kotha hai, kahan jaat ho, ka karat ho. So it is their benefits. It's not the poor trolleymen or poor coal cutters. So yes, so I think that, but then I realize, and there again, I'm very fond of giving an anecdote, which I, of course, heard from Professor M. Mujib, the Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia, that if you remain Marxist, even after 30 or 35, then you are not maturing. But I realized that, Marxist in the sense of, believe in violence, that, the reality comes from the barrel of the guns. This is what, in fact, my friend from Calcutta, and I would not mention their names, would always emphasize, who turned later, in fact, from CPM to Nakshal. But, I remember this, that your maturity means that now you, in fact, go to a situation where you think of transforming or making your word, acceptable, your argument acceptable to your listeners, to your audience, in a very peaceful and polite way. And you should not, in fact, believe that the truth is confined to whatever you have said. The truth could be also somewhere else. And this was, in fact, the reason. And I learned much more, in fact, from my study of Dara Shikoh. And you see that, I'm very fond of Dara Shikoh compared to Aurangzeb. And I'm very fond of Jahanara. And I have seen that Jahanara, on the one hand, she is a Qadri, on the other hand, she is still Chishti. So it's Chishti. And she can also reconcile with her brother after he came to power. But she would insist that jizya should not be imposed. She, of course, expressed her, her own opposition. And she would appreciate, of course, the claims of his brother Aurangzeb in his, in fact, rivalry and competition with Dara Shikoh. But she was acceptable to Aurangzeb, and therefore Aurangzeb would approach her. So that position, that you are listening to everyone, that is that reconciliation or accommodation, that became my methodology. And therefore, you would notice that even as early as in 1983, when I published my book, a crisis of empire, I decline very vehemently. And you can imagine that what kind of conversation would have gone behind. Very vehemently, I declined to dub Jaduna Sarkar as quote unquote communal. So of course, it is, and there it was very relevant, in fact, because what was the factor of the decline of Mughal Empire, religion or no religion? And at that time too, when I believe that it was primarily, rural disturbances or something, class, uh, not class in exactly in the same term. But later on, I realized that yes, the culture, tradition, expression of that, quote unquote mode of production is also important. So this is what my position then became, and perhaps that is why I am an admirer of Darashuko and Jahanara, who were appreciative of the others' traditions as well as integrative and accommodating. At any rate, whether as a result of my eclectic training, that is, madrasa. I have spoken to you earlier that
Yes.
in madrasa too, in fact, when I started deviating from my teacher's position, I felt that I'm doing some sort of sinful act. But then I remembered that, if you are really a student, shagird, then if you do not differ with your teacher, you are
Sure.
not contributing, in fact, to the furtherance of knowledge,
To the discourse, to the
to the
debate,
discourse. Yes.
to the
So
furtherance of that
yes,
knowledge.
you maintain, of course, respect and reverence for your teacher, but difference is and disagreement is an essential part of in fact, furtherance of promotion of the boundaries, of extension and expansion of the boundaries of knowledge. So whether
Muzaffar,
yes,
I'm just sort of aware, sensitive of time. We've just gone beyond the hour.
yes,
We have a couple
yes,
of questions from the audience, and I'll
yes,
put them to you, and then we can conclude our discussion.
yes, yes,
We talked about the fundamental difference in the approach of the the Qadiris and the Chishtis on the one hand, and the Naqshbandis who came in from Central Asia with regard to the indigenous people. The reconciliation on the one hand and complete non-reconciliation. So there's a question from Chandrodoy De who asks, what is the reason behind it? Why is it that the Naqshbandis, why do you feel that the Naqshbandis were so orthodox and so strident that there is no question of reconciliation? Whereas very early on in the Chishti tradition, in the genealogy, even during the days of the Delhi Sultanate, there had already been this approach. Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia, Hazrat Amir Khusro, and people of that time, which is several hundred years before the Mughals, in fact. Even at that point of time, they had this philosophy of reconciliation. Why do you think there was this big difference?
I should say that sometimes, it's like asking why this fellow is so bigot and that fellow is so reconciling and understanding. Even in our own time, we observe amongst our own friends, some of them we are very uncomfortable with even to have conversation. So one response I would be that it also depends sometimes, besides the environment in which you are growing. If you are growing in an environment where you do not notice or do not confront the differences, then you think that this is the full world. And the second, in fact, I would think, as this is an ordinary, layman's response, the individual's nature. And even amongst the Naqshbandis, for instance, and I have shown this, in fact, in the introduction of my book, even amongst the Naqshbandis, very, very, in fact, Mujaddidi Naqshbandi, Sarandi Naqshbandi, you have later, in fact, the approach which you cannot, in fact, reconcile with the one that you would notice, say, in Sheikh Ahmad Sarandi or in his immediate successors, Sheikh Masum Sirindi or Sheikh Khwaja Muhammad Naqshband, with reference to Shias or with reference to the non-Muslims. In course of time, in the 19th century, and late 19th and even in early 20th century, in one branch of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi tradition from Bahrain, you have even the non-Muslim Hindu as a Sufi. And when that Hindu, in fact, he says to his master, when he's, what are the procedures, that I can't tell you. These are convoluted, unless, as they say, that Sufism is a matter of mushahada. Sufism is not a matter of mukalama or mutala'a or mubahasa. It's not a matter of discourse. It's not a matter of studying a book. It's a matter of your own observation. So I have not, of course, gone into that world. So I cannot say that. Then when this Hindu murid, Hindu disciple, asked his master that I feel that I should become Muslim, only then I'll be a perfect Sufi. So the Naqshbandi Sufi says, Naqshbandi Mujaddid, you don't have. It is not necessary. So you have seen, in fact, in course of time, maybe that this is in response to the forces that these Naqshbandi in the late 18th,
circumstances, the forces, the
in the late
environment.
18th, early 19th century, in the course of the decaying power of the Mughal,
Yes.
they noticed and they thought that they have to reconcile. But, that
Change
also
reality.
could not be, in fact, a full explanation, because simultaneously you also have other traditions through Sayyid Ahmad Shahid, who is, in fact, all for war, all for war. And in fact, he died fighting against the Sikhs instead of the British East India Company, even if he was preparing himself to fight against the East India Company. Yeah. So this is what my response would be. It is very difficult. I have seen, in fact, in my own family, sometimes it's very difficult for me to talk to him or to her. And even with reference to our own times, changing politics in northern India, you talk to people and you will find the differences. So it could be, in fact,
Very sharp, very, very stark differences.
Yes.
Yes. So I think those kind of orders have undergone their own mutations in a way in our current times, and the discourse in some shape or form actually continues.
And yes, I should add that while in the 20th century, in the Chishti traditions, you would notice that Sama completely disappeared. Sama,
it's gone.
Or
Yes.
completely. Maulana Ashraf Ali Thani would never, in fact, agree to even think of this much about the validity or legality of Sama. And similarly,
It was impossible in the 17th century, right, to think of practices without the observance of Sama.
Yeah, and secondly, in the 20th century, you have two major Chishti Sufis, Hussain Ahmad Madani and Ashraf Ali Thanvi. Ashraf Ali Thanvi would, I would not use that term, the word that he uses for Gandhiji, and Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani became a part of, in fact, Congress party, and he accepted Gandhiji and Jawaharlal Nehru as the leaders, and he believed that, in fact, there is one thing, in fact, country, and there is another thing, your religion, etc. So the two Chishti Sufis, in fact, having two different. And so how would we explain? Yes.
Indeed. Muzaffarji, this has been absolutely riveting, engrossing as always, highly enriching for me, and I'm sure for the viewers as well. We've gone way over time, so we'll probably conclude this particular session. I'd like to thank you very deeply for being part of this discussion, and hopefully have you back many times, hopefully in person next time. A big thank you
in Kolkata.
Yes, in Kolkata, indeed. A big thank you to Tata Steel, a big thank you to the University of Chicago Center in Delhi, because this has been the first of the new webinar series in 2021. Thanks also to all of the other partner sponsors. A big thank you to Malavika, to Sukanya, and everybody else at Game Plan. And last but not least, thanks to all of you viewers for taking time off this weekend evening, to listen to our conversation. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you again.
And thank you very much. And to the listeners, especially, whom I cannot, of course, see, but I hope that they would not have found these discussions they would have found of some substance, of some importance. And I hope, and I would welcome any criticism, negative or positive. Positive criticism is, of course, healthy criticism, and negative, of course, that dismissing. I would welcome if you go through the book, and if you feel that I have not been fair to the evidence, as I believe that I have not been in the 17th century, I have examined the things from the 20th century Muslim League point of view or the Congress point of view, please do write to me, and I would be very happy to respond and to learn from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Okay.